Dobar dan i dobrodošli u novu epizodu FENIKS podcasta. Evo nas u Londonu. Pričamo o jednoj važnoj temi koja pretpostavljam svima nama od biti ili ne biti značaja. Pričamo o medijima. I pošto mislim da su sve te priče zapravo o slobodi medija sada ekstremno povezane i da ne postoji sad neke velike razlike između toga kako zapravo funkcioniše to, kako dobijamo informacije i koje informacije dobijamo i ko finansira, ko kontroliše medije u Srbiji i u nekim drugim državama koje idu ka tom autoritarnom modelu. Pošto ceo svet ide ka autoritarnom modelu, mislio sam da je jako zanimljivo da napravimo neko poređenje, i da razgovaramo o tome sa profesorom sa Goldsmiths univerziteta, Desom Fridmenom, koji je bio nekadašnji šef odseka za studije medija na Goldsmiths univerzitetu. Des, welcome to FENIKS podcast.
Thank you.
You're a professor of media studies at Goldsmiths.
That's right. I was head of department until a couple of years ago, and I'm a professor, but also I would say many other things are going on. So I was one of the founders of the Media Reform Coalition in the UK, which was started nearly 15 years ago now, which campaigns for media democracy and accountability. And I research on issues of media and democracy, media and capitalism, media policy and power.
You wrote several books on those subjects. Let me start with questions. The question that should be obvious. The answer should be obvious, but it's not actually. What is the mainstream media right now? What is the primary source of information for the majority of audiences? Because for my generation, instinctively, when people say mainstream media, I think of, I don't know, CNN or BBC or whatever. But is it Joe Rogan now?
In a way, those are two different questions. What is mainstream media, and what are the means by which most people get their information? And it's not an obvious question at all. You know that. So it depends from country to country. In the UK, the major news source still in 2025 is the BBC. And the BBC is mainstream media to the extent that this is an officially regulated platform, which really has way more audiences. So that is both for its broadcast, radio and television, and online. It is by far the biggest source. This will be different for, in other countries where you mentioned Joe Rogan podcast. That has enormous audiences. Still, it is not the biggest audience in the country, but I think you have to look at the direction of travel. And so what we know is that those traditional sources of information, which by and large have come up through terrestrial television and radio, are now have amplified their audiences and amplified their voice in digital ways. So it's not just a question of who is digital or not. Everyone is digital. For me, the mainstream refers to a kind of political perspective, as well as a set of relationships, commercial relationships. And it's a really hard question because, is Joe Rogan mainstream media? Well, actually, he's quite a mainstream guy. He reflects increasingly the mainstream of American politics, but he happens to be using a relatively new digital platform. So I guess at one level, he is not classically mainstream, but is that a helpful way of putting it? This is a man who articulates pretty conventional mainstream, sometimes confused, but mainstream voices. So, it should never be seen as a question of technology. I think it's probably more helpful to think of it as a set of political relationships. And that will be different in lots of different countries.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I meant what's the primary source of information for citizens?
Yeah.
Like the source of information that they trust in, or they get their information in, and how is that used or abused will be the next question, but let's focus on this.
Trust is difficult enough
yeah.
because, levels of trust have rapidly declined. They have plummeted across lots of different areas of our information system. So, for example, in the UK, so forgive me for talking about the UK, and it would be very different in Serbia for very obvious reasons. But in the UK, the BBC is slightly more trusted than other outlets. That doesn't reflect that well on the BBC. It just reflects really badly on the other outlets. And it's by medium specific to a certain extent. So often radio is trusted a little bit more than television, which is trusted significantly more than social media. Social media is not trusted, even though this is increasingly how we share our experiences and make sense of the world, but we don't do it on the basis of trust. So this is quite a confusing thing. And the other thing to say is, that if you have to drill down, you have to investigate a lot of these surveys about where do we get information from. So across most countries now, the answer will be social media. Now, social media what does that mean? That refers to a lot of different things. So to the extent that social media is the primary means by which we access information, who is the primary source? And on social media, the BBC are extremely influential player. So when it comes to Facebook, which is still used, I don't know if anyone in your audience still is on Facebook, who knows?
Probably not.
Probably not, but anyway, just take Facebook. Actually take any, it doesn't matter which one. You go on to TikTok. Major news providers are, of course, taking advantage of these platforms. So you might have what seems as something like a new or insurgent platform, but as long as more traditional providers are trying to hegemonize that platform, then it's still pretty traditional and pretty mainstream. So I'm sorry for such a long answer, because it's an important question.
Because can Joe Rogan sway the opinion of voters to such a degree that it decides the results of US elections?
Well, can any single broadcaster sway the results of an election? Personally, I don't think so.
When I say Joe Rogan, I mean every investor and every interested party that's invested into that platform in order to accomplish political goals.
It depends on how you look at the audience. If you think there is an audience that is so easily manipulated and brainwashed, then it is more likely for you to think, you can have a single platform or a single broadcaster, a single person who manages somehow to change the course of history. That's not how I see history developing. To the extent that Joe Rogan, why are we talking about him so much? Well, I guess we know why, but as a symbol.
Joe Rogan as a symbol.
As a symbol.
Yeah, of course.
So, and there will be Joe Rogans in many different countries. To the extent that you have those single powerful actors, and they do make a difference, but there has to be an appetite. There has to be a reason why the Joe Rogan figure is being absorbed in a way that other sources of information are not. And I think we are very much in a period where over decades, traditional sources of information, whether that is state broadcasters, which are still powerful in countries like Serbia, although I would still say they are powerful in countries like Britain as well. Maybe they are losing, trust in many different places, and there are new, as I say, more insurgent forces coming up. But I still don't see them as the primary pushers, drivers of political change. I think that is a wider structural question. If people have lost faith with their political culture, with their political environment, with their political system, that's the crucial thing. And who reflects that best will benefit from it. And I think Joe Rogan, the actual Joe Rogan, has really benefited from a crisis in American liberal democracy. You know, over the last 20 years, American liberal democracy has imploded. And there are these new figures, both in terms of Trump, but also in terms of this new media ecosystem that reflects these very difficult new times. So I don't think it's ever about one platform, one person, one podcaster, one professional that makes the difference. They are operating within broader failures of political systems.
That's interesting. I'm going back to this question of these single podcasters or groups of them or whatever, because they have not been regulated by any kind of, they have not been integrated into the system of say, any kind of democracy. So basically what they can say anything, they can just bring a person who has PhD in economy and some lunatic from the street, and everything is treated equally. And that's, in my opinion, that's kind of adding up to the destruction of trust in any source of information, because you can be a professional journalist who devoted their entire life to researching one subject and who has hard scientifically proven data for something, and then you have like anti-vaxxers who are just spreading misinformation and basically bullshit via these channels who did become sort of mainstream for some audiences.
That it's a great point, and I agree with what you're saying as a concern, but I'm not sure what the consequences are. And there are 2 points, 2 parts to my answer. The first is this less regulated environment, at one level, should have benefits for progressive people. Now, it also has benefits for reactionary people, as you've just been outlining. But it should, in theory, allow for voices which have by and large been excluded from traditional, highly regulated mainstream media to emerge. And I think in Britain, you certainly see that with a whole range of new independent and progressive media who don't have to play by the old rules of impartiality and neutrality and objectivity, which are sort of professional codes of conduct, which I believe have often been used to police debate. Not just to regulate debate, but to police debate. So at one level, much as there are terrible platforms full of disinformation and allowing, like you're saying, people to deny historical truths, there are also progressive voices. So that's one point. But the more important point in a way is, well, was it so perfect with regulated broadcasters and regulated media? And this is a huge debate in Britain, with a very strong public service culture. And I think there are many things that Gaza has taught us. One of the things is that highly regulated and supposedly impartial broadcasters like the BBC, like Sky and like ITV, that they have not delivered to audiences what needs to be delivered. They have not delivered accurate and impartial news, and that's within a regulated structure. So you have to also look at the failures of regulated media. This isn't new. The BBC internally has had discussions about how it has covered climate change, and if it did exactly as you've said over with anti-vaxxers, it used to have scientists who understand the debate, and then for balance, it would go to one person who represents climate denial just to get the balance. But of course, there's no scientific balance around the issue of climate change. We know what the scientific consensus is. So the BBC, as one of the world's premier news organisations, had this crazy idea that if you're going to have a climate change scientist, you need to be balanced out by someone who denies it. Even they realised this was not right. But when it comes to Gaza, no, they have not learnt the lesson. So to the extent that there is someone who will talk for the Palestinian people, they absolutely think it has to be balanced out by an Israeli spokesperson. Now, what does that mean? It means you don't actually get a truthful account of what is going on over there. So I think regulation, in theory, is necessary because you don't just want an absolute free-for-all. On the other hand, you have to question who is in charge of regulation and in whose interests it operates.
It's a very complex issue.
It is.
We've opened up because, when we talk about how the big capital controls the traditional media, then we can also open up a question of how big capital, how easily it can actually buy off supposedly independent internet podcasts, whatever. So it's all part of the same bigger problem. But about the BBC, I mean, it's a very, very different coming from Serbian perspective, because for the last at least 30 years, nobody serious believes national television because we know it's a propaganda tool in the service of regime. But what became more extreme in the last 13 years of this now full-fledged dictatorship of Vučić regime is that they have created so much noise and so much trash with these supposedly entertainment channels that they also replicate all the major talking points of the regime. So every single news outlet, no matter if they cover sports or entertainment or whatever, that's controlled by the regime, is now in service of their agenda. That's like complete authoritarian state, the mafia state, basically. But in the UK, it's different. BBC has been seen by many, and as you say, there is a lot of public trust it was at least. But Gaza made that sort of explode in our faces, because we saw that this divide between what is said and what is true really became an abyss.
It absolutely. I mean, I think there's a long debate about the difference between state broadcasting and public service broadcasting. This isn't an academic point. This really does affect how we find out about what's going on in the world. So in some places, it's pretty stark. In Hungary, in Serbia, in North Korea, okay, we, at great cost to many people, we know that these are state broadcasters with propaganda. And then you think, but Britain is completely different. This is a public service broadcaster, license fee.
In Serbia, in theory, it is also public service.
Okay.
We all pay for it.
And you pay for it, yeah. Well, maybe there are more overlaps, but this is my point. There are more overlaps. So people who defend the BBC now will still say this is public service. I think more and more, if you look at something like Gaza, it is not completely irresponsible to say that this is a state broadcaster, because you're looking at the interconnections between the states and the broadcaster itself. At the very top, you're looking at the relationships between government and the people who run the BBC. I'm not talking about many ordinary journalists, many of whom are extremely unhappy with the corporation, with the BBC's coverage of Gaza. They're also very scared to speak out because they think they will lose their jobs. So there is tension. I mean, there's been lots of tension in public service, state media systems as well, where there's been strikes and disputes. So, in Britain, there is an argument that's going on, but you have to look at the kind of cliques who run at the very top of these organisations. And, there are all sorts of, some of the same people, they alternate between government and the media. This is a kind of revolving door at the top. And that has a real impact on the overall editorial agenda. It doesn't mean that there is absolutely no room for opposition. And that's what's important. So in Britain, there is, every now and again, there is space to ask difficult questions. But then let's look at it. Over Gaza, the BBC has commissioned one very significant documentary looking at the murder of doctors, the murder of medical staff in Gaza. It commissioned it, and then it refused to show it. Now, why did it refuse to show it? Well, one day we will find out exactly what's happened. But, you know, ultimately they asked for so many changes. They neutralized it, and the program eventually was shown on another station, Channel 4.
But that's extreme. What did they offer as an explanation? If they did.
They basically, what they're saying is it didn't fit the BBC's editorial values because, and this goes back to my earlier point around impartiality, this program was not impartial. How is it? I mean, how can you be impartial about the mass murder of medical staff in a genocide? You know, it makes no sense. Are you impartial? Should we be impartial about racism? Should we be impartial about the destruction of our environment? I mean, you can't be impartial about genocide. So this is where the official editorial policy, which is there apparently to protect us against abuses of power, actually works, you know, against the interests of the public. And that's not just a one-off documentary. I think you see this with so much of the coverage in the major broadcasters. And remember that when I say major broadcasters, these are broadcasters whose opinions are mobilized online. So it's not just this is on your television, this is on every screen, in every phone. And what's happened is, for the first 18 months after the 7th of October, there were many things that were not discussed. Genocide wasn't mentioned, war crimes weren't mentioned. Something shifted around 6 months ago. And what shifted was a political consensus of Israel's role started to shift. In other words, I think that Western governments started to be increasingly uncomfortable with what Israel are doing, because Israel is supposed to be a stable force in the Middle East. Well, it sure as hell isn't. You know, people have figured it out. It isn't that. They've lost any kind of credibility. And so the political shifts slowly started to take place. And that's when you start to see the BBC suddenly discovered that genocide is taking place. This wasn't to do with brave journalism. This was to do with the door opens a bit, the window opens a bit. And so, genocide, war crimes. This is happening in what is supposed to be, you know, one of the more democratic media landscapes. They have policed the debate on Gaza and on the role of Israel, and they have marginalized questions of occupation, marginalized questions of Palestinian liberation in the same ways you would find in a absolute state-controlled system. So it's disappointing, but this is what we are faced with.
But very important question, did this happen as a new development, or this Gaza situation just unraveled an unpleasant truth that we weren't facing for years and years and years? Because you started to engage in this organization trying to regulate media and their responsibilities, etc., after the phone hacking scandals. So that was before Gaza,
yes.
Well,
there are two different things going on, because phone hacking was very much to do with newspapers, which by definition were never regulated, whereas the BBC and broadcasters were regulated. So can I quickly go back to that in 2 points?
Absolutely.
Is this question of the lack of impartiality new? So am I allowed to give one historical example? The BBC is 100 years old, and its first test was in 1926. There was a general strike, very important event, a general strike. The country stopped in Britain, the coal miners and then everyone else stopped working. This was at the very beginning of the BBC, and the BBC struggled to think, what do we do? How do we represent, how do we report on this crucial issue? And the BBC took the decision that it was much better to side with the government for its own protection. It's a famous example. The BBC, it said, needed to be seen to side with the government. That was its very first test in 1926, and it failed. Now, that doesn't mean there's a smooth line. The BBC's coverage, sometimes there are some significant, and sometimes quite exceptional moments in its very long history. So it doesn't just go like this, but by and large, it is a creature of the state. It has tensions, it has arguments, it has tens of thousands of workers who don't all agree with what their employers are doing. So it isn't straightforward, but it is a creature of the state.
But
so
sorry to interrupt, but that became very apparent to me recently. Even I was listening to Hard Talk conversation with our president, the dictator.
Yeah.
It was amazing to me and horrifying actually how unprepared the host was. Because he was actually just pushing the state line about, okay, what's Serbian relation to Russia, and basically Russia was the main topic of conversation. So no mention of corruption, no mention of complete destruction of institutions and democracy, of connection within organized crime that's become actually the state is the crime syndicate, and it's like just you see that they didn't even Google it. You know.
Well, they might have Googled it, and they might have thought, this isn't a subject I want to touch on. Russia is the frame. Well, especially when you think about Serbia, no, Russia is the frame that we're going to use. So that may have been a decision. But it's interesting you refer to that program, because that program has now been axed by the BBC, and it was one of the better programs.
I didn't know that.
It's one of the better programs, and even then it was seen to be too kind of independent in spirit. But by and large, and this is not a huge surprise to me, because if you think about the BBC's coverage internationally through what's now called the World Service, but remember the World Service used to be called the Empire Service, it's funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, I'm not saying that this means that civil servants working for the Foreign Office are the broadcasters. That's not the case. But the fact that it is funded by them and it operates in that orbit, and strategic questions about where do we broadcast, in what languages, what are our priorities. These are political priorities. These aren't just independent journalistic decisions. How individual journalists react to that is more complicated. And of course, World Service is still seen to have quite a progressive role in areas of the world where there is literally no freedom of speech. Okay, fine, that's true. But I mean, certainly it doesn't mean that it is free of political considerations at the very core.
Okay, so is the divorce between this political influence and what should be a publicly funded, independent civil service, is it possible? Because you have been working on that subject and that agenda for a long time now. Is it achievable, maybe?
You mean to reunite the public with the media?
Yes, and divorce the media from the influence of, like, I don't know, maybe Keir Starmer making a phone call and trying to influence.
The key is to make sure there is a divorce between all aspects of power. So that's corporate power and political power. Yeah.
When I say Keir Starmer, I meant all of that.
Yes, all of that. That again, he's a symbol of other things. That is the major question, and it is extremely difficult. So in the Media Reform Coalition, we've been working for 15 years. We did emerge out of the phone hacking crisis in the UK because that was a crystallization of the abuse of media power. So this was a situation in which some of the biggest newspapers in the country were found to have been hacking the phones of celebrities and ordinary people. And it came to the fore when it was discovered that journalists had hacked into the phone of a murdered schoolgirl. And this was too much, for the British, rightly for the British public. And as some very good investigative journalism was carried out, which uncovered widespread practices of phone hacking and other criminal activities and embedded relationships between some journalists, corporate owners and the police in this country. Absolute nexus, filthy nexus of corruption. And this was a moment in which people were saying media power was on the front page. So we were part of that movement trying to really, to open everything up and hold the media to account. And they wriggled out of it. So Rupert Mardok was at the heart of this, one of the world's biggest media moguls. And he shut down the newspaper, the News of the World. He shut it down overnight. This was a newspaper that had been around for more than a century. He shut it down overnight because it was an embarrassment. Did Rupert Mardok shut his empire down? No, Rupert Mardok is still one of the most powerful people. It seems as if he's just about to be given control of TikTok by Donald Trump, partial control of TikTok.
He outlived Logan Roy from Succession.
Yeah, he did. Well, unless Logan Roy suddenly makes a miraculous return. Anything is possible in Hollywood. So that was a dramatization of, the most pernicious elements of abuses of media. And it also shows their power. This is the frustrating thing. 15 years later, I wish I could say we'd won. We haven't won. There are still, you just look around. There is more media concentration. There are more examples, particularly across areas of Eastern and Southern Europe, of media capture, which is exactly what, you in Serbia, there is no distance between the media and official structures. So it comes back to the role of independent media, but more importantly, for me, this is the crucial question, it comes to the role of mass movements, of social movements. Without them, we have no hope. Because it is in those campaigns and those mobilizations and those mass protests and those kind of ruptures that we will start to see new forms of media, new forms of communication emerge. And it also puts real pressure on existing media. You will, this is where we welcome the digital. Obviously, there are some, we rely, and I know you in Serbia have relied on particular platforms just to communicate.
This student uprising
without
happened without Instagram.
Yeah, right. But is Instagram a friend? Is Instagram a reliable, transparent media organization? We have no control over Instagram at all. Instagram is owned by the world. I forget if it's still top 10, world's most wealthy corporations. Yeah. So it is not a reliable ally of progressive movements. But of course we rely on it. So we need to go beyond this. We need to find independent means of communication. And that will only come about if the movements themselves are big enough. So media democracy, for me, it's a kind of lifetime, that sounds too grand. But anyway, it's something I've been working with for many, many years. And it's deeply frustrating because you are all the time experiencing the abuses of media power. But then something like Gaza happens and there's been incredible coverage, not least, and I think it's always worth putting on record, the amazing work done by Palestinian journalists in Gaza, more than 250 of whom have been killed by Israeli forces. So, that's an incredible testimony to the power of journalism.
Also ordinary citizens.
And of course, that's right. Because, sometimes ordinary citizens become involved. They become journalists where there is no other alternative. So, it depends what day you catch me on. Sometimes I'll be in despair. Sometimes I will be optimistic about the new platforms and new voices that are emerging.
Yeah, same here. Like one day, it's like bipolar thing. In the morning, I'm optimistic. In the evening,
that's true. It's not just one day; it's each hour. Yeah,
each hour. But the maybe the one distinction for Serbian audiences is here in the UK. You talk about the problem of state control of what should be civil service like BBC, and on the other hand there is a clear division between that and the tabloid newspapers of Rupert Mardok. In Serbia, tabloid newspapers are actually what is the main purveyor of voice of the government. So they're owned and controlled by the government. So all the trashy tabloids have been more powerful than the national TV. Because in the national TV, you have, for example, a syndicate of people who are trying to be independent or critical. I mean, there are very few of them and there is very little they can do, but still, it's a huge organizations with 1,000 employees modeled on the BBC. And there are still maybe some people who are trying to do anything. It amounts to almost nothing in the end in such a political system. But mainly the main difference is that it's one and the same in Serbia. Like all those trashy tabloids are even doing the actually maybe even the worse work, than the sanitized version of state propaganda on national TV.
But you see, the British, it's a really interesting situation, but the British state is very clever. I'm not saying the Serbian state is not clever, but the British state is very old and it is very protective of its interests. And if you're the British state, you don't want to be seen to be owning all the means of communication, because that gets in the way of your claim that you are one of the world's oldest democracies. It's much better if you say there is a state and an elected government, and then we are held to account by this diverse and noisy media system. That's what they like to say. Now, of course, we've already discussed with the BBC, there are all these intimate relationships between the state and the government and the BBC. But, it's also the case that exists not as directly as in Serbia, by no means. But the fact is that Rupert Mardok has been extremely close to almost every prime minister. And prime ministers have been extremely fearful of Rupert Mardok's influence. So the British state doesn't need to own newspapers. It has operated in some kind of informal alliance with both tabloid and broadsheet newspapers for many, many years. They have a coincidence of interests. They share many of the same views. So obviously the most famous examples with Rupert Mardok and Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister in the 1980s, they were ideologically close, and each one represented each other's views. So it's true, the government doesn't own any trashy tabloids, but it doesn't want to and it doesn't need to, as long as by and large those trashy tabloids are happy to say, we agree with you, broadly speaking, that immigration is a problem. They may have different views specifically, but immigration is a problem. That by and large, we need to increase defence spending. There is literally no debate across any elements of the British media that maybe we should put more money into public services and not, as Donald Trump has demanded governments, NATO governments do, increase defence spending. There is no debate about this. You'd think there'd be one newspaper that would say, maybe The Guardian, that would say, well, there's a significant debate around this. Let's reflect that. No, there isn't.
And also, you mentioned environment. That's a topic that, at least theoretically, we should all agree that's the key to our survival.
Wow.
And it's been grossly understated and put under the carpet and ignored by major media.
Absolutely. The environment is a really interesting topic because the balance of opinion, the political consensus, has clearly shifted that there is a serious problem. 10 years ago, it really was, we were in a different place. But by and large, and there are many different researchers who will back this up, how is climate change covered? It's still, to give you the best example, it's very individualized. In the US, this is notoriously true. It's all about, but I think it's true in European media as well. There is an unwillingness to really tackle the fact that that we have a political problem with the system as a whole. That this is endemic to capitalism. That it destroys the environment. No, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about what you as an individual consumer can do to moderate your footprint, your carbon footprint. And so they individualize this. So they'll say, yes, there's a problem. Yes, we need to do something about this. but it's about you and me. It's not to do with the giant pollutants. Now, at the moment, everything is about AI. I don't know as much in Serbia. In Britain, the whole public debate is about AI. And it's, about jobs. It's life will never be the same again. It's all these grandiose claims without drilling down into really what AI is doing. But the one thing we do know about AI is it is an enormous drain on power. Absolutely. Britain at the moment has a problem with its electricity generation, and if they want to realize this AI revolution, they're going to have to change the electricity grid. And they're going to have to think about, well, what are the consequences for climate change of this wonderful revolution? That's too much for the poor British brain. No, let's not talk about that. Let's just keep focusing on the individual. And still, to this day, when there are heat waves, what are the pictures that you see? You see pictures of people on British beaches in their bikinis. You don't just say, well, hold on a second, why have we had yet again the hottest year on record? No, that's not the question to analyse scientifically. So even where there is a topic that has shifted, it's still, there are corporate priorities, political priorities, and the structural questions are always minimised.
It's interesting that you raised a very important topic, and we'll get into it, but I wanted to say that I stopped listening to a lot of podcasts, especially after this major shift of a political change of a political system in the States. Primarily the Gaza was one trigger, Gaza situation, and the other trigger for me was the refusal of pseudo-intellectuals to expand the debate outside the perimeters of a capitalist paradigm.
Yeah.
That was the major thing for me, because the crisis is so evident, at least to me, that I cannot continue to listen the same talking points about finding solutions within the same dysfunctional, dead, parasitic paradigm, and then coming to the one of the topics you raised, and I think it's a very important one. Now we have these tech bros from Silicon Valley, and I think there was a huge, I don't know if it was coordinated or it was error or just lack of education by primarily American politicians. They failed to see and integrate them into the political system. So Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and the others are just these players that have power like small countries or more. Not small countries, actually much more. And this political power haven't been coded into our political system. In no, I don't know. There have been some attempts in EU to sort of regulate this, but this is I don't know who said. I think Varoufakis said that this is the techno feudalism. So it seems to me that the political system has changed. Just nobody informed us.
Well, see, for me, it's not that this is techno-feudalism. This is capitalism. This is what capitalism has always done. And I think these tech bros and the tech oligarchy is new. It is seriously disturbing in the scale of power that it has, but it is not unprecedented. We have seen that this kind of, we've had other media oligarchs who have had outsized power, from Hearst in the US, as a deeply disturbing character. So it's not unprecedented. And of course, these were the new tech bros. These were people who had, but Musk was a Democrat supporter until he realized that the Democrats were not going to do it for him. So these are, to a certain extent, they're ideological opportunists. But I think more and more we're seeing actually not an opportunism. We are seeing, the extreme libertarianism that was there at the heart of the online You know, the emergence of the internet in the 1990s, you know, this was driving neoliberalism, but this is an extreme form, which obviously does see any kind of regulation as a barrier, any kind of working class organisation, labour organisation. That's a barrier to personal and corporate profit making. And, you know, the climate at the moment, there's fewer barriers stopping them. So the attempts at unionisation, they seem to have stalled. We have to hope that they keep coming back. But I don't think, you know, I wouldn't describe it as something, because techno-feudalism makes it sound like it's just this completely new, although its novelty is that it's taking us back 500 years. I see it as much more this continuous tension in capitalism between the extreme concentration of wealth and power using technology, and it means that it requires the same responses, which is how do you make these people accountable? Polite forms of regulation, relying on the European Union and hoping that some kind of regulatory framework is going to, that's not going to work. It's true that such is the scale of the power of tech companies that they are disrupting any kind of semblance of competition for profit. So it's likely the EU, you know, will try and address it at the top, and there will be fines, but they're not actually addressing the systematic corruption and gluttony and abuses of power at the heart of this system.
But also we wouldn't be talking about this if it didn't affect both the UK and Serbia.
Yeah.
If it was just purely American problem of American capitalism getting to another level, but they're actually actively involved in politics. They're financing the extreme far right in the UK and Germany. They're meddling in European politics heavily, and that's a huge problem because they have enormous influence. The platforms that they have algorithms that can selectively push this agenda or cancel other agendas. So that's kind of becoming a global issue, not an internal American issue.
No, absolutely. And we have to find ways. If old polite regulation hasn't worked, we need much more feisty and aggressive forms of regulation, which are going to say to someone, you know, to a platform like X, you know, we will shut you down. We will remove the possibility of you operating to the best extent we can if you continue just completely to ignore any kind of, you know, respecting rules against hate speech. You know, and people say, you can't stop, you can't shut X down. I mean, you see all sorts of examples, you know, of countries which are able to do, through a whole range of both technological, financial and political rules, to make it almost impossible for these giant platforms to operate. They are extremely powerful. They are meddling in internal affairs. They are not all powerful. They still rely on particular infrastructures and, you know, funding, methods of funding. And that's where, you know, it does still make a difference. I'm not just saying give up at all. I'm saying we need, if it's a political solution, we need politicians who are really going to say, I am not frightened of all of this. I'm going to use a mandate which is to stand up to abuses of corporate power. It will be difficult. They will be crucified by the media of any one country of interfering with profit making and so on. They have to mobilize their constituency. And if this doesn't happen, then we are going to see increasing amounts of interference into domestic politics by primarily North American companies, and with disastrous effects. You know, nationalism is not a foreign, British nationalism at the moment. It's not that it's a foreign problem. This is a problem with British roots, but it's being made worse because there are platforms and finance which are fueling the flame, fanning the flames. So it is, I completely agree with you. It is something that we have to, you know, it's a major, major concern. But all the time it comes back to what do we do ourselves? This is the question. No, what's happened in Serbia? The whole question of political power and the state, it wasn't about media reformers or journalists who started this. This was a student movement which, through its energy and its breadth, brought in other players and asks fundamental questions. Now, I hope you win. I don't know what's going to happen. But it's a lesson for everyone that it has to start with what we do, with what the social movements are, with the scale and the ambition of the social movements, because we will be at the heart of producing a political solution. Otherwise, X will continue to poison our political cultures.
It's been a really interesting thing that showed how fragile this illusion of power is.
Yeah.
This whole student-led movement in Serbia. It's a widespread civil disobedience movement that actually shows what is the basic truth. There are more of us than it is of them. And
absolutely.
if we mobilize and if it continues, then we might as well win. But do you think, as a researcher in history of media, journalism has evolved for a long time? And by learning from mistakes, there have been some standards have been created. And do you think maybe we or should demand that these standards can be applied to these unregulated platforms like Instagram? Why don't we hold them, ask to hold them accountable as if they were a newspaper?
Well, the trouble is that newspapers are bad models, because newspapers are part of the problem. And even, as I've said, regulated broadcasting is part of the problem. So you think of a platform like Facebook. I mean, you can't really moderate Facebook. Facebook is based, its DNA is based on exploiting data and poisoning, any kind of democratic debate. The algorithms are not neutral when it comes to Facebook. So it's hard to think of, can we reform Facebook into something nice? So I'm pretty pessimistic about this. It would be nice to think we could have a, quote, public service algorithm, but I mean, when are we going to get this? I just think there's an old... we should socialize the data centers. I can't remember who now said this. Data needs to be controlled by the public. And as long as there are Facebooks and X's, then this is going to be a very big battle. Your question was also about, as journalists, can we learn from history? I never know the answer to this, because first of all, history is really badly taught, or not at all taught in relation to media. It's a kind of niche area, which is such a shame because it's so crucial. The media themselves lack any kind of historical context. Just think of Gaza. The lack of history is just staggering. We have empirical evidence about just how few references in news reports there are to 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba and occupation. It just doesn't exist. It's like everything started on the 7th of October 2023. So history is often absent, partly from academia, certainly from the media. But what is inspiring is you don't need to have a historical understanding. Sometimes journalists are reacting to the conditions they find themselves in, and where they are allowed, or where they have a space to report and to make sense of the world. I'm sure both of us are still inspired by independent journalism. It's done in incredibly difficult conditions. It's very brave. But what we have is a media system that doesn't do justice to its best media, to its best journalists. More people still want to train at my university. They want to become journalists because they actually have an ambition to speak truth to power, to try and make sense of the world. And I'm not going to stand in their way and just say, no, you shouldn't be, because actually any kind of organization will stifle your enthusiasm. No, I want them to go and be brilliant journalists and cause trouble. But the fact is that the structural constraints we have are fairly overwhelming, and that's the job we have to take on.
But that's a beautiful sentence you said, that the best are simply not rewarded for being best and thus discouraged to continue doing. But people do it instead, in spite of.
They do it in spite of,
of everything. So what are the like? Give me some optimism in the end, but realistic optimism. Like what's
well, I mean,
how are we going to face this? What are the best ways that we are already maybe discovering to facing these challenges and exposing the challenges? Because many people are unaware of a lot of problems that we are talking to, and unaware of how much actually they impact their own lives.
The optimism, I think, starts from the movements themselves. No, I am optimistic because of what's happening in Serbia. If you're in Serbia, you may not feel optimistic right now, but believe me, there is a legacy for people outside Serbia who think, this was really difficult circumstances, and yet, oh my God, you managed to shut the country down. Okay, you haven't won yet, and maybe you won't win. But the lesson is we can fight and we can ask profound questions of these rulers who say that they are, supremely powerful. So this happens in many different countries, and I think you will find media responses, because there will be networks, and this is where obviously the digital has helped us. It's easier, the barriers are lower in terms of us finding communicative responses to this. So I write for a platform called Declassified
Yes.
UK, which specialises in foreign policy. I am optimistic when I see the huge appetite for work that Declassified UK is doing.
Thank you for that, because I'm reading it.
Oh, great, but who's also reading it are civil servants and ministers, and they are worried by, we have managed to make changes to particular, what goes on in military bases in different countries. That used to be something that some of the mainstream newspapers would have done many years ago, that have stopped doing that. And so new forces have to emerge. And so my optimism is all the time that people will not just sit back and take it. And as long as that's the case, we have to think of, well, what are the communicative needs? And is it going to be, the podcast that we're on now? How will that link in to organising resistance? How do we support journalists inside mass media organisations? Don't just write them off and just say you are propagandists. Well, the editors certainly are, and the senior journalists are. But I mean, not everyone is. Many people are scared to speak out. We should be trying to give confidence to people to speak out. That will be, certainly in Britain, this has to be a question of strengthening unions inside our media, and particularly inside digital media. Until we've tried everything, I will remain optimistic.
Des, thank you for this wonderful conversation.
My pleasure.